Most people assume that when God separates you from a narcissist, the narcissist finally feels sorry. They imagine regret looks like sorrow, like tears, like remorse, like a quiet confession that says, "I see what I did now." But that assumption is deeply mistaken. Because when God intervenes, the narcissist does not first feel guilt, they feel exposure. What unfolds next is not repentance, it is reckoning. Not a reckoning driven by conscience, but by the sudden realization that something they relied on has been removed permanently. This is not the story people expect to hear, but it is the one that explains why separation feels final, why your peace came back so slowly, and why justice did not arrive through confrontation, but through distance. What follows are not stages of healing, they are stages of regret. And regret, in the narcissistic mind, does not mean "I hurt you." It means "I miscalculated and I cannot undo it." Stage 1. Realization of irreversibility. Regret does not begin when you leave. It begins when the narcissist realizes that leaving has become permanent. At first, nothing feels alarming to them. Separation has happened before. Distance has appeared before. Silence has always been survivable. In their internal logic, separation is never final. It is merely a pause before the familiar order restores itself. They are accustomed to believing that time bends in their favor, that emotions soften, that attachment pulls people back into place. They do not panic because they assume continuity. They assume that you will eventually re-engage, even if reluctantly, that you will explain yourself, that you will check in, that you will break the silence first, as you always have. The narcissist does not need affection to feel secure. They need predictability, and for a long time, you provided it. But then something unsettling begins to happen. The silence does not break. Not after days. Not after weeks. Not after moments where, in the past, you would have reached out to relieve tension. What registers first is not grief, but confusion. The expected rhythm has been interrupted. The usual emotional gravity no longer pulls you back into orbit. The narcissist begins to sense that the familiar cycle, conflict, distance, reconnection, is failing to restart. And that is when the question quietly emerges. What if this is not temporary? This thought is deeply destabilizing, because narcissistic stability is built on one assumption, that outcomes can always be reversed. That, with the right leverage, timing, or emotional display, situations can be reset. Control, for them, is not dominance. It is the belief that nothing is ever truly lost. But when God separates you, something changes beneath the surface. The separation does not occur through escalation or confrontation. It occurs through withdrawal, through stillness, through a quiet removal of access that leaves no argument to respond to and no emotional thread to pull. The narcissist begins to notice that you are no longer positioned as an option. You are not hovering in uncertainty. You are not signaling readiness. You are not emotionally present in the background. The absence is structural, not emotional. This is the critical distinction. They realize that they are not dealing with resistance. They are dealing with finality. At this stage, regret does not look like sadness. It looks like recalculation. The narcissist mentally revisits recent interactions, scanning for indicators they might have misread. They search for signs that you are still emotionally available, still reachable, still influenced, not because they miss you, but because they need to know whether the situation remains reversible. And the absence of evidence becomes evidence itself. Each day that passes without response reinforces a reality they do not want to accept. This separation is not waiting for negotiation. It is not open to reinterpretation. It is not something they can fix by adjusting behavior temporarily. This realization cuts deeply because it introduces a new and foreign concept into their inner world: loss without recourse. For a narcissist, loss is tolerable only when it can be reframed or undone. But when separation occurs beyond their control, when it does not depend on their approval, their permission, or their participation, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes exposure. They are exposed to the fact that their influence had limits, that their access was conditional, that the role they occupied in your life was not permanent by right, but sustained by your endurance. And when that endurance is removed, so is the illusion of inevitability. This is where regret first takes root, not as remorse, but as the recognition of miscalculation. They begin to understand that they assumed too much, that they pushed too far, that they treated permanence as entitlement. And most unsettling of all, they begin to suspect that this outcome cannot be reversed. They do not yet feel the full weight of what has been lost, but they sense that something essential has shifted beyond their reach. The structure that once absorbed tension, regulated instability, and preserved their sense of control is no longer in place. This is the moment where regret becomes possible, not because they feel compassion, but because they feel consequence. And once the mind accepts that an outcome is irreversible, it does what it must to cope with that reality. It begins to measure what existed before against what exists now. Stage 2. Comparative regret. After the initial realization that the separation may be permanent, the narcissist does not sit with sorrow. They begin to compare, not in a sentimental way, not in a reflective way, but in a calculating one. They start to place their current life beside the life they had when you were still present, and the contrast begins to disturb them in ways they did not anticipate. At first, the differences feel minor. A slight increase in tension, a subtle lack of ease, moments that feel heavier than they used to. But over time, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Things do not resolve as quickly anymore. Discomfort lingers. Emotional friction no longer disappears on its own, and this is when comparison sharpens. They begin to remember how life functioned when you were there, not how you made them feel, but how much effort you quietly absorbed. When instability had somewhere to go, when emotional volatility did not immediately demand self-examination, when problems softened instead of escalating. At the time, none of this was acknowledged. It was assumed, taken as the natural order of things. You were simply there, adjusting, compensating, explaining, enduring. And because it was constant, it became invisible. But comparison changes perception. Without you, the narcissist begins to encounter resistance where accommodation once existed. They notice that others do not tolerate the same patterns, that emotional swings are met with boundaries instead of patience. That inconsistency now produces consequences. This does not feel like loss to them. It feels like inconvenience, and inconvenience is often the first doorway into regret. They begin to recognize that when you were present, life required less effort from them, less regulation, less accountability, less adaptation. You carried weight they never acknowledged, not because you were weak, but because you were willing. You stayed engaged when disengagement would have been safer. You smoothed over disruptions that should have forced reflection. You kept things functioning when they should have broken down. This is the comparison that unsettles them, because it reveals that what they lost was not emotional supply alone, but a stabilizing structure that protected them from the full impact of their own behavior. And that structure has not been replaced. They may try, through new relationships, through distraction, through constant activity or validation, but the same ease does not return. The same tolerance does not appear. The same emotional buffering does not exist. And slowly, reluctantly, they begin to understand something deeply uncomfortable. What they had with you was not common, not because of romance, but because of endurance. Very few people are willing to remain in imbalance for long periods without demanding change. Very few people continue to adjust while receiving little in return. You did, and now that willingness is gone. This is where regret deepens, not because they miss you as a person, but because they miss the environment your presence created, an environment where instability was survivable, where consequences were delayed, where control felt effortless. Comparison exposes that loss with increasing clarity. They see that life now feels less regulated, less contained, less predictable, and this awareness irritates them because it suggests a miscalculation. They assumed your presence was guaranteed. They assumed your patience had no limit. They assumed endurance equaled obligation, and comparison proves otherwise. This realization does not soften them. It tightens something internally. Because regret, when it is not paired with humility, becomes dissatisfaction rather than insight. They may tell themselves that this discomfort is temporary, that adjustment simply takes time, that something better will replace what was lost. But comparison does not stop. Each new interaction highlights what no longer exists. Each failed attempt to recreate the old dynamic reinforces the same truth. What they had depended on your participation, and your participation is no longer available. This is why regret at this stage feels restless instead of reflective. Why it creates tension instead of learning. Why it produces irritation rather than change. They are not grieving connection. They are confronting the loss of a system that once shielded them from consequence. And as this comparison continues, the internal pressure it creates begins to demand release. Regret stops being quiet. It becomes a persistent, unresolved tension. Stage 3. Missed opportunity awareness. At some point, comparison stops being abstract. It becomes personal. The narcissist no longer measures the past against convenience alone. They begin to sense something far more disturbing. An opportunity has been lost, not delayed, not misplaced. Lost. This is the moment where regret sharpens into awareness, because what they begin to recognize is not simply that life was easier before, but that a specific window closed while they assumed it would always remain open. They start to understand that they did not just lose access to you. They lost timing. They lost leverage. They lost the ability to return to a version of the dynamic that no longer exists. This realization does not arrive gently. It arrives through friction, through repeated encounters that fail to recreate the past, through people who do not respond the same way, through situations that no longer bend around them. They begin to feel something unfamiliar. Pressure, not emotional pressure, structural pressure. The pressure that forms when a system no longer absorbs strain. When they were with you, many things never reached consequence. Tension was diffused, conflict was softened, instability was managed quietly. Now, without you, everything reaches the surface. They feel exposed to outcomes they are not prepared to face. And this is where regret changes character. It is no longer passive dissatisfaction. It becomes internal tension. They begin to recognize that they pushed too far for too long, that they assumed endurance where there was only patience, that they treated your willingness to stay as proof you would never leave. This is not empathy. This is realization. They see that if they had adjusted sooner, things might have remained intact. If they had moderated their behavior, you might still be there. If they had responded differently at key moments, the structure might not have collapsed. These thoughts do not lead to humility. They lead to agitation, because awareness without accountability creates unrest. They begin replaying moments not to understand you, but to identify where control slipped beyond recovery. They fixate on points of no return, the conversation they dismissed, the boundary they ignored, the moment they assumed you would tolerate just a little more. And slowly, the truth forms. They misjudged the cost. They assumed your limits were negotiable. They assumed your exhaustion was temporary. They assumed your departure would function like every other separation. It did not. This is where regret becomes heavy, because they recognize that the opportunity they squandered cannot be recreated under the same conditions. Even if contact were restored, even if communication reopened, even if circumstances aligned again, the version of you that absorbed imbalance is gone. They begin to sense that you crossed a threshold they cannot reach back across, and this awareness unsettles them deeply. Because narcissistic functioning depends on the belief that nothing truly ends, that every outcome can be reframed, that every loss can be repaired. But missed opportunity breaks that belief. It introduces finality. They begin to feel trapped between what was and what is, unable to return, unable to recreate, unable to fully accept. This creates a constant internal tension that does not resolve. They may distract themselves. They may stay busy. They may seek validation elsewhere. But the pressure remains, because regret at this stage is no longer about comparison. It is about consequence. They recognize, though they may never articulate it, that they were given more time than most people would have offered. More patience, more chances, more grace, and they wasted it. This realization does not produce repentance. It produces urgency, because when someone becomes aware that an opportunity has been permanently lost, the instinct is not to reflect. It is to regain control. The narcissist begins to feel that something must be done, not thoughtfully, not carefully, but quickly, because time now feels dangerous. Time confirms loss. Time solidifies separation. Time strengthens your independence. And this awareness that delay works against them pushes regret into its next form. Regret stops being internal pressure. It becomes a motive, a force that demands action. Stage 4. Repair fantasy and urgent re-engagement. At this stage, regret is no longer quiet. It becomes urgent. The narcissist reaches a point where internal pressure can no longer be managed by distraction alone. The missed opportunity awareness has done its work. The comparisons have sharpened. The realization has settled. They did not just lose a relationship, they lost a position. And when a narcissist loses position, time becomes an enemy. Time does not comfort them. Time does not heal them. Time exposes them. Because time does one thing they cannot tolerate. It strengthens your independence. Every day you remain stable without them is a day the old system loses power. Every week you do not re-enter the cycle is a week their influence decays. Every month you do not respond is a month the story becomes harder to rewrite. This is why urgency appears. They begin to feel that if they do not act now, the outcome will solidify into permanence. They sense the door is not merely closed, it is disappearing. And this is where the repair fantasy forms. They begin to imagine reversal as if it were still possible, not because they have truly changed, but because they cannot bear the finality. They convince themselves that there is a combination of words that will reopen you, a tone that will soften you, a display that will disorient you, a moment of vulnerability that will reawaken your compassion. They may even believe it, because a narcissist often mistakes intensity for truth. If they feel urgent, They assume the urgency must mean something sincere is happening inside them. If they feel anxious, they interpret it as love. If they feel pressure, they call it growth. But pressure is not repentance. Pressure is simply pressure. True repentance moves toward truth, even when truth is humiliating. It moves slowly. It accepts consequence. It does not demand immediate relief. The narcissist does the opposite. They move quickly. They compress time. They rush the process. Because the goal is not transformation. The goal is relief. Relief from the tension of loss. Relief from the discomfort of irreversibility. Relief from the growing awareness that what they dismissed cannot be reclaimed. This is why their behavior often shifts abruptly. Coldness becomes warmth. Distance becomes attention. Dismissiveness becomes concern. And to the wounded heart, this can feel like a miracle. Because you waited so long to be seen. You endured so much without acknowledgement. You prayed for a shift that never came when it mattered. So when the shift appears now, it can feel like God finally touched them. But this is where discernment matters. A change that appears only when you leave is not a change of character. It is a change of strategy. They may offer partial responsibility, but it is often vague. They may say, "I know I wasn't perfect." They may say, "I've been thinking." They may say, "I miss you." Yet notice what is missing. Specific truth, sustained humility, a willingness to sit under consequence without bargaining. Instead, they seek rapid resolution. They want closure fast. They want reconnection fast. They want the emotional distance repaired fast. Because speed is how they protect themselves from reality. Time threatens them because time tells the truth. Time proves you are not dependent. Time proves you can breathe without them. Time proves you can rebuild without returning. So they press for contact, not necessarily with overt force. Sometimes with emotion. They appeal to your compassion. They awaken your memory. They speak in a tone that sounds gentle, almost reverent, as if they have finally understood the sacred weight of what they did. But regret can mimic sincerity. It can sound like awakening, and still not contain repentance, because repentance is not a moment, it is a path. It is consistency over time. It is truth without performance. It is accountability without urgency. It is change that remains even when access is restored. The narcissist's re-engagement rarely offers that. What they are testing in this stage is not love, it is your boundary. They want to know if your separation is firm or flexible, if your silence is stable or temporary, if your new peace is rooted or fragile, because if they can get even a small response, they can rebuild the old system. A single message can become a doorway. A single conversation can become leverage. A single moment of sympathy can become a reset. This is why the pull often feels intense. It is not the intensity of devotion. It is the intensity of desperation. They do not want to lose the reference point you became. The proof that someone left and did not return. The evidence that their influence has limits. So they attempt to rewrite the outcome. They create a version of themselves that appears softened. They present remorse without specificity. They speak the language of repair without submitting to the cost of repair. And if you return too quickly, the stage ends, not because healing has occurred, but because relief has been achieved. The urgency fades, the pressure lifts, the motivation dissolves. And slowly, almost predictably, the old patterns begin to reappear, because the system has been restored. But if you do not return, if you remain steady, if your boundary holds, if your silence continues, then the repair fantasy collapses, and the narcissist is forced to confront what they most fear. not your anger. Finality. Stage 5. Regret without transformation. At this stage, the narcissist no longer believes the outcome can be reversed, not because insight has arrived, not because humility has taken root, but because every remaining attempt has failed. The urgency has burned out. The repair fantasy has collapsed. Access has not been restored, and what remains is something far more difficult to manage. Finality. This is the point where regret does not disappear. It retreats. It moves inward. It becomes quieter, more contained. From the outside, this phase often looks like calm. They stop reaching out. They stop reacting. They stop circling your life. They may appear composed. They may seem indifferent. They may act as though the separation was insignificant. To the wounded observer, this can feel devastating. As if the entire relationship was disposable, as if you never mattered, as if they escaped consequence entirely. But this appearance is deceptive. What looks like peace is not peace. It is emotional shutdown. The narcissist does not resolve regret at this stage. They seal it. They compartmentalize the loss so it cannot threaten their self-image. They place it in a psychological box labeled irrelevant, over, unimportant, not because it truly is, but because acknowledging its weight would require honesty. And honesty would expose patterns they have spent a lifetime avoiding, so they create a narrative that allows them to move forward without transformation. They tell themselves the relationship was flawed from the beginning, that nothing meaningful was lost, that separation was inevitable. This story is not crafted for truth. It is crafted for survival, because regret, if allowed to deepen, would demand repentance, and repentance would demand change, and change would require surrender. The narcissist refuses all three. So regret becomes something they carry without integrating. They may replace you quickly, not because they have healed, but because replacement offers distraction. Attention becomes anesthesia. Novelty becomes numbness. Movement becomes proof, at least to themselves, that they are unaffected. But replacement does not erase regret. It buries it. The awareness remains beneath the surface. The knowledge that something valuable was lost, that someone left and did not return, that a structure they relied on collapsed beyond repair. This awareness does not speak loudly. It surfaces indirectly, in irritability when the past is mentioned, in defensiveness when questioned, in discomfort when reminded of your stability, because your stability reflects something they do not possess. Integration. You are no longer fragmented by the relationship. You are no longer managing contradictions. You are no longer suppressing truth to maintain connection. And that contrast unsettles them. They may insist they are fine. They may claim they moved on easily. They may portray themselves as unaffected. But inner consequences do not require confession to exist. They work quietly. They show up as dissatisfaction that no new connection fully resolves, as restlessness that activity cannot calm, as the persistent sense that something essential is missing without the humility to name it. This is regret without transformation. It does not soften the heart. It hardens it. The narcissist learns the wrong lesson. Instead of understanding the cost of their behavior, they focus on preventing future exposure. They resolve not to let anyone matter as much again. Not because closeness is dangerous, but because consequence is. They become more guarded, more controlled, more committed to avoidance. And this is where regret finally settles, not as sorrow, not as repentance, but as bitterness, a quiet resentment toward a reality they cannot change. They may never speak your name again. They may erase you from their narrative. They may insist the relationship was meaningless. But denial does not erase consequence. It internalizes it, and internal consequences are relentless. They do not announce themselves. They do not seek validation. They do not require your participation. They surface in moments of stillness, in the inability to rest, in the subtle awareness that something was lost through miscalculation. This is the final truth of regret for the narcissist. It does not redeem them, but it does confirm something essential. They know somewhere they refused to look that they were given time, patience, and grace far beyond what most people would have offered, and they squandered it. That knowledge remains, even if they never admit it. When regret stops and order remains, what this journey reveals is something many people struggle to accept. Regret, by itself, is not redemptive. It can acknowledge loss without correcting character. It can recognize consequence without producing change. And a narcissist can live inside regret for the rest of their life, without ever moving toward repentance. This is why the separation did not lead to transformation on their side, because transformation does not begin with loss. It begins with truth, and truth requires humility. What God removed was not merely a relationship. He removed a distortion where endurance was mistaken for love, where patience was confused with permission, where access was treated as entitlement. When that distortion was corrected, the narcissist was left with regret, not as punishment, but as exposure. Exposure to the limits of their control. Exposure to the consequences they can no longer avoid. Exposure to a reality that no longer rearranges itself around them. That exposure does not heal them, but it clarifies something essential. They now live with the knowledge that something was lost through miscalculation. That grace was extended longer than it should have been. That opportunity was wasted because it was assumed to be permanent. And that knowledge remains, quietly, unresolved, without your involvement. For you, the outcome is fundamentally different. You were not removed to teach them a lesson. You were removed to stop carrying a burden that was never meant to be yours. Your peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of order. Order in your nervous system. Order in your discernment. Order in your sense of self. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer mistake regret for change. You no longer wait for remorse to justify your decision. That is not hardness. That is maturity. Justice, in this story, does not arrive through spectacle. It arrives through alignment. Alignment with truth, even when it is quiet. Alignment with limits, even when it feels lonely. Alignment with a moral order that does not require you to stay broken in order to prove you loved. The narcissist's regret marks the end of their access. Your restoration marks the beginning of your life. And that is how this story ends. Not with collapse, not with confession, but with order restored, and you no longer standing in the place where disorder once survived.